Sound cannot travel through a vacuum. There is no air, no medium, nothing to carry it. In 1969, 3 military pilots, not engineers, not scientists, orbited behind the moon, completely cut off from Earth, with no equipment built to investigate anything unexplained. What reached their headsets should not have been possible. Something was recorded. It still exists today. Section 1. The Apollo 10 Space Music Mystery. On May 18, 1969, 3 American astronauts launched into space on a mission that history mostly remembers as a rehearsal. Apollo 10 was NASA's dress run for the moon landing, a full test of every step Apollo 11 would take 2 months later, except the actual touchdown. The idea was simple: fly to the moon, separate into 2 spacecraft, drop the lunar lander down close to the surface, test everything that mattered, then pull back up and head home. Nothing about this mission was supposed to make headlines 50 years later, but something happened during that flight that astronauts do not usually admit to hearing. NASA actually considered attempting a full landing on this exact mission, skipping the rehearsal step entirely. Mission planners decided against it. Every piece of hardware involved, the lunar module, the navigation computer, the docking systems, had never been tested together in real lunar orbit before, and a mistake made while trying to land could have ended the entire Apollo program on the spot. Practicing every step short of touchdown first was the safer bet, even if it meant Apollo 10 would spend the rest of history known mainly as the flight that came close but did not finish the job. The crew was Commander Tom Stafford, Command Module Pilot John Young, and Lunar Module Pilot Gene Cernan. Following a tradition that had started earlier in the Apollo program, they gave their spacecraft nicknames. The Command Module, the part that would stay in orbit around the moon, was called Charlie Brown. The Lunar Module, the smaller craft meant to test a close approach to the surface, was called Snoopy. Both names came from the Peanuts comic strip, which NASA had unofficially adopted as a mascot during this stretch of the space race. The 3 days it took to reach the moon were, by Apollo standards, fairly routine. The crew spent much of the trip going over checklists, catching sleep when they could, and broadcasting live television back to Earth, footage that more than 1 billion people around the world ended up watching in pieces across the mission's several transmissions. Not everything about the trip went smoothly. Stafford accidentally used a double dose of chlorine while treating the crew's drinking water, and since that same water had to be mixed into their dehydrated meals, every dinner for the rest of the flight came out tasting faintly like a swimming pool. Small annoyances aside, the crew stayed on schedule, and by the time they reached the moon 3 days after launch, Apollo 10 settled into lunar orbit exactly as planned. Once in orbit, the crew got their first look at something no human being had ever properly described before: the sight of Earth rising over the moon's horizon. Cernan later remarked that it was magnificent, a moment that briefly pulled the entire crew's attention away from checklists and toward the window. It was a preview of exactly the kind of moment Apollo 11 would become famous for 2 months later, except almost nobody outside the space program noticed it happening on Apollo 10 first. About 4 days into the mission, roughly 102 hours after leaving Earth, Apollo 10 reached the far side of the moon. This is the part of the moon that never faces Earth, and every mission that flew there lost radio contact with Houston for about an hour at a time, simply because the moon itself blocked the signal. This was expected. Mission planners built it into every flight plan. Nobody down in Houston panicked when the radio went quiet, because they knew exactly when it would come back. Before the strange sound ever entered the picture, Stafford and Cernan had already completed the mission's real centerpiece. The 2 men undocked Snoopy from Charlie Brown, leaving Young alone in orbit roughly 60 miles above the surface, and fired the lunar module's descent engine to drop down to just 47,400 feet above the moon, a little under 9 miles, the exact altitude at which a future crew would need to begin its final powered descent to an actual landing. From there, Stafford radioed down a simple description of what he was seeing, describing the terrain below as a fantastic sight full of different shades of brown and gray. Cernan, watching the ground pass beneath them, told the capsule communicator back in Houston that they were down among the details of the surface, close enough to survey and photograph the exact patch of ground in the Sea of Tranquility that Apollo 11 would attempt to land on just weeks later. This was the real technical achievement of the mission, and it was happening only a short while before the far more famous, far stranger moment that followed once the spacecraft rounded the moon into radio silence. During this pass, Stafford and Cernan were inside Snoopy, preparing to separate from Young in Charlie Brown, and practice the kind of maneuver a future crew would need to perform when leaving the moon's surface. While they worked through their checklist, all three men started hearing something odd through their headsets. It was not static. It was not the usual hiss and crackle of a weak signal. It had a shape to it, almost a melody, rising and falling in a way that plain interference does not usually do. Cernan was the first to say something out loud. He asked Stafford if he could hear it too, describing it as a whistling sound, something that sounded, in his own words, outer spacey. Stafford agreed he could hear it. A few moments later, Young, alone in Charlie Brown on the other side of the moon, radioed over to ask if they were hearing the same whistling sound he was picking up in his own spacecraft. All three of them were hearing it, in two separate vehicles, at the same time. For the next several minutes, the conversation kept circling back to the sound. Cernan called it weird music. Young wondered aloud what it actually was. At one point, Young said something that has since become the most repeated line from the whole incident. He said nobody back home would believe them. That single sentence captures the moment better than anything else recorded that day. Three trained military pilots, on the far side of the moon, cut off from Earth, hearing something they could not explain, and half joking that no one would take their word for it. What makes this moment stand out is not panic. None of the three men sounded frightened. They kept working through their procedures the entire time, checking systems, preparing for the next stage of the test, occasionally pausing to comment on the sound before returning to their checklist. A few minutes after the strangest part of the exchange, Cernan and Stafford went ahead with the planned separation of the ascent stage, the very maneuver they had been rehearsing when the sound first caught their attention. Right after that separation, the lunar module briefly spun out of control because a guidance switch had been left in the wrong setting. A completely unrelated problem that the two men quickly caught and corrected. In the middle of an already strange orbit, they had two separate surprises to deal with within the same half hour, and they handled both without losing their composure. Once Apollo 10 came back around to the near side of the moon and radio contact resumed with Houston, the whistling sound stopped. It did not fade out. It did not linger at a lower volume. It simply stopped. The same way static disappears the instant a radio signal locks back in. This detail matters because it is one of the biggest reasons the sound was never treated as any kind of emergency or system failure. Once the spacecraft was back in normal communication range, whatever had been causing the sound went away with it. Snoopy and Charlie Brown reunited a few hours later, docking back together after nearly 8 hours apart, an event broadcast live back to Earth, in color. With the lunar module's main job finished, the crew jettisoned it entirely, firing off its remaining fuel to send it past the moon and into its own orbit around the sun, the only Apollo lunar module ever to end up drifting through deep space rather than crashing into the moon or burning up back at Earth. From there, Apollo 10 spent its final days coasting home, with the crew handling routine housekeeping, some navigation work, and, in a small first for the program, becoming the earliest Apollo astronauts to shave in space, using a brushless cream designed not to leave stray whiskers floating around the cabin. The trip home ended with a record that still stands more than 50 years later. As Apollo 10 fell back toward Earth on a faster trajectory than any Apollo mission before or since, the spacecraft reached a top speed of roughly 24,791 miles per hour relative to the ground, the fastest any human beings have ever traveled. Cernan later described the view during that fiery re-entry as looking like being wrapped inside a ball of white and violet flame. The capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean on May 26, 1969, just a mile and a half from its intended target, and was recovered by the aircraft carrier USS Princeton. To this day, Stafford, Young, and Cernan remain the fastest human beings in history, a record no crewed mission has come close to breaking since, simply because no crewed spacecraft has traveled back from beyond low Earth orbit at that same speed in the decades that followed. For years, almost nobody outside of NASA and a small number of space history enthusiasts knew this recording existed. It was not because the agency was hiding anything sinister. Documents and recordings from that era of the space race were often marked as restricted simply as standard practice, especially anything tied to test flights that were still considered sensitive during the competition with the Soviet Union. The full transcript and the actual audio of the Apollo 10 crew talking about the music were both part of the public record from very early on, sitting in NASA's own archives for anyone who wanted to go looking. There is also a simpler, more human reason the story stayed quiet for so long. The astronauts of that era worked inside a culture that prized calm, controlled behavior above almost everything else. Being seen as someone who got spooked by strange sounds or who talked too openly about anything unexplained could put a career at risk. NASA needed the public and Congress to see its astronauts as steady, rational professionals, especially with so much money and national pride riding on the moon landing happening on schedule. Bringing up an eerie whistling sound heard on the far side of the moon was not the kind of story that helped an astronaut get selected for another flight. So very few of them talked about strange experiences in space, unless they were asked directly. And even then, most answers stayed short and practical. When NASA engineers eventually looked into what caused the sound, they landed on an explanation rooted in ordinary radio physics, rather than anything about the moon itself. Both spacecraft, Snoopy and Charlie Brown, were equipped with their own VHF radio systems. VHF simply meaning very high frequency, a common band used for short-range communication. When the two spacecraft were operating close to each other, each with its own transmitter and receiver running at nearly matching frequencies, the two signals could interact with one another. When two radio waves of very close frequency overlap, they can produce what is called a beat frequency, an audible tone created purely by the interaction between the two signals, rather than by any outside source. That interaction, engineers concluded, is most likely what produced the whistling and warbling sound the crew heard through their headsets. This kind of interference was not unique to Apollo 10. Similar strange tones were reported during other lunar missions that used the same kind of two-spacecraft VHF setup, which supports the idea that this was a real, repeatable side effect of the equipment, rather than a one-time fluke. What made the Apollo 10 crew notice it so strongly was the setting they were in. They were completely alone, cut off from Earth, flying over the far side of the moon, a place no human being had ever orbited alone in a small spacecraft before that year. In that kind of environment, with no other context to compare it to, an ordinary radio quirk can sound like something else entirely. For decades, the story mostly stayed inside space history circles, brought up occasionally in books about the Apollo program, but never widely known outside of it. That changed in 2016, when a cable series called NASA's Unexplained Files aired an episode built around the recording. The show leaned hard into a spooky tone, using dramatic music, shaky footage, and a narrator who described the whistling as extremely unsettling. The clip spread quickly once it hit the internet, and within days, people who had never heard of Apollo 10 were sharing the audio online, some treating it as proof of a decades-old cover-up. Gene Cernan, who was still alive at the time and had gone on to become the last person to walk on the moon during Apollo 17, responded directly to the renewed attention. He said plainly that he did not remember the moment being significant enough to take seriously at the time. He said it was probably just radio interference, and added that if the crew had believed it was anything else, they would have said so in their official debrief after the flight. According to Cernan, the three of them never gave it another thought once they were back on the near side of the moon and the sound had stopped. What makes this story worth sitting with is not that it proves anything supernatural happened above the moon in 1969. The far more interesting part is how ordinary the explanation turns out to be, and how much distance there is between that explanation and the eerie feeling of the original recording. Three men, further from another human being than anyone in history up to that point, heard a sound neither they nor anyone on Earth could immediately explain. And their first instinct was not fear, it was curiosity, followed by a joke about whether anyone would believe them. Decades later, people still do not fully believe the calm explanation, not because the science is weak, but because the audio itself still sounds exactly as strange today as it did the moment Cernan first asked if anyone else could hear it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Apollo 10 recording is not the only moment in the history of crewed spaceflight where something happened that never received a comforting explanation. Not every strange event from a real space mission ends with three curious astronauts finishing their checklist and heading home safely. Some end in a spacecraft going completely silent, and a recovery crew opening a hatch to find something no one back on the ground was prepared for. Section 2. The only humans to die in space. In April 1971, the Soviet Union launched Salyut 1, the world's first space station. After losing the race to put a man on the moon, the Soviets shifted their entire space program toward a new goal, proving that human beings could live and work in orbit for weeks at a time. Salyut 1 was meant to be the proof. All they needed was a crew who could dock with it, move in, and stay long enough to show the world it could be done. Salyut 1 itself was not built from scratch as a purely scientific project. It started life as a modification of a Soviet military space station program called Almaz, which was already in development at the time. After Apollo 11 landed on the moon in July 1969, Soviet leadership made the decision to redirect the country's primary human spaceflight ambitions away from a crewed lunar landing and toward orbiting space stations instead, holding on to the idea that a moon landing might still happen later, in the 1970s, if the Soviet Union's own giant N-1 rocket ever became reliable enough to fly. That rocket never got there. The N-1 suffered 4 separate catastrophic launch failures, and in 1974, Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev formally cancelled the lunar landing program altogether. Salyut 1's construction began in early 1970, and after nearly a year of assembly, the station was shipped to the Baikonur Cosmodrome for final preparation. Soviet planners originally wanted the launch to coincide with the 10th anniversary of Yuri Gagarin's historic first flight, but technical delays pushed the actual launch back by about a week, and Salyut 1 finally reached orbit on April 19, 1971. The first attempt came close, but did not work. On April 22, 1971, the crew of Soyuz 10, cosmonauts Vladimir Shatilov, Alexei Yeliseyev, and Nikolai Rukavishnikov, launched toward the new station. Shatilov was already one of the most experienced cosmonauts in the Soviet program, flying his third spaceflight after commanding the Soviet Union's first successful docking between 2 crewed spacecraft 2 years earlier. After roughly 24 hours of careful maneuvering to close the distance, Soyuz 10 managed to soft dock with Salyut 1, but a flaw in the docking mechanism's design meant the two spacecraft could never achieve a full, secure hard dock strong enough to safely open the hatches between them. The crew and ground controllers spent hours trying to solve the problem. At one point, engineers even worried the crew might not be able to undock from the station at all, since the same malfunction that prevented a secure connection also complicated the process of safely pulling away. Eventually, ground controllers worked out a way to interrupt power to the mechanism, allowing the docking probe to retract and the two spacecraft to separate. The mission still was not finished, causing problems. During the fiery return through Earth's atmosphere, toxic fumes began leaking into the crew's cabin, and Rukavishnikov lost consciousness before landing. Shatilov and Yeliseyev remained alert enough to guide the capsule to a safe touchdown, and all three men were found to be in stable condition once recovery teams reached them. But they had come home from what should have been a triumphant first space station mission, having never actually set foot inside Salyut 1 at all. The Soviet space program needed a second try, and this time they needed it to work. The crew chosen for that second attempt was originally supposed to be Alexei Leonov, Valery Kubasov, and Pyotr Kolodin, all experienced cosmonauts. Just days before launch, doctors found a shadow on an X-ray that looked like it might be tuberculosis in one of the crew members. Rather than risk it, Soviet officials made the decision to swap out the entire prime crew for their backups. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev, the backup team, suddenly found themselves preparing to fly a mission that had been someone else's just a few days earlier. Dobrovolsky would command the flight. Volkov, who had already flown once before, would serve as flight engineer. Patsayev, on his first spaceflight, would serve as the research engineer, running the station's scientific experiments. Soyuz 11 launched on June 6, 1971. The following day, the spacecraft successfully docked with Salyut 1, and this time the hatch opened without a fight. When the three men floated into the station for the first time, they found the air inside smelled smoky and burnt, likely leftover residue from the station, sitting unused in orbit since its own launch weeks earlier. Rather than risk staying inside an atmosphere they weren't sure was safe, the crew retreated back into their Soyuz capsule and spent the next full day there while engineers on the ground helped them figure out how to fix the station's ventilation system. Only once the air cleared did they move in for good. What followed was, for most of the mission, a genuine success story. The crew spent 22 days aboard Salyut 1, running scientific experiments, sending back live television broadcasts that were shown across the Soviet Union, and slowly building toward a new record for the longest time any human beings had ever spent in space. They were not without problems along the way. 11 days into their stay, a fire broke out inside the station, serious enough that mission planners on the ground briefly discussed whether the crew should abandon Salyut 1 entirely and come home early. The crew managed to handle the fire, and the mission continued. Later in the flight, the crew discovered that using the station's exercise treadmill, something they were required to do twice a day to help their bodies cope with weightlessness, caused the entire station to shake and vibrate around them. A planned highlight of the mission, watching the launch of a massive Soviet rocket called the N-1 from orbit, ended up being postponed, and the crew never got to see it. By the time their 22 days aboard Salyut 1 came to an end, Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev had already set a new spaceflight endurance record, one that would not be broken until the American Skylab program 2 years later. On June 30, 1971, they said goodbye to the station, sealed themselves back inside their Soyuz capsule, and began the process of coming home. The return procedure started normally. The capsule separated from Salyut 1 and flew freely for 3 orbits around Earth before Dobrovolsky oriented the spacecraft for re-entry and fired its engine for 187 seconds to slow it down. 9 minutes after that engine burn ended, At an altitude of roughly 80 miles, the spacecraft reached the point where it needed to split into its three separate sections. Only the middle section, a bell-shaped module with the three cosmonauts inside, was designed to survive re-entry and carry them back to the ground. The other two sections were meant to be blown away, using small explosive charges, a completely normal and expected part of every Soyuz re-entry. This time, something went wrong. The shock from those explosive charges, firing at the same moment, jarred open a valve that was never supposed to open until the capsule was already much lower, safely inside Earth's atmosphere and descending under its parachute. That valve's entire purpose was to let outside air rush into the cabin once it was safe to do so, equalizing the pressure before the crew stepped out on the ground. Instead, it popped open while the capsule was still effectively in space, and the air inside the cabin began rushing straight out into the vacuum around them. The valve was small, and it was located underneath the cosmonauts' seats, which meant none of the three men could see it or easily reach it. What they could do, and what the evidence later showed they did, was work the problem as fast as their bodies would let them. Investigators believe Volkov and Patsayev shut down noisy equipment inside the cabin so they could listen for exactly where the air was escaping from, while Dobrovolsky checked whether the hatch itself had somehow come loose. All three men seemed to have eventually figured out that the valve was the source of the leak. The trouble was that decompression sickness, the same kind of pain and disorientation deep-sea divers can suffer if they surface too quickly, was already setting in, along with sudden hearing loss from the pressure change. In the confusion, they appear to have grabbed the wrong valve to close first, and by the time that mistake became clear, there was no time left to correct it. None of the three men were wearing pressure suits. This was not an oversight. Soviet engineers had deliberately removed the suits from this version of Soyuz to save space, because the capsule had originally been designed to comfortably fit 2 cosmonauts, and mission planners wanted to fit 3. Without suits taking up room, 3 men could just barely squeeze in wearing regular jumpsuits instead. A number of cosmonauts and engineers at the time reportedly pushed back against this decision, worried about exactly this kind of scenario. But the program's chief designer at the time dismissed the concern, reportedly insisting that a Soyuz capsule losing its air in space was not something that could realistically happen. Telemetry data recovered later from biomedical sensors attached to one of the crew members showed that death occurred within about 40 seconds of the cabin losing pressure. By roughly 935 seconds after the engine had fired to slow the spacecraft down, less than 16 minutes later, the cabin pressure inside the capsule had dropped to 0. A medical review of the data afterward noted that 50 seconds into the emergency, one crew member's breathing rate had spiked to 42 breaths per minute, a pattern doctors recognize as a body in the final stages of oxygen starvation. Radio communication with the crew went dead at almost exactly the same moment the equipment compartment separated from the capsule, cutting off contact well before the point in re-entry when a communications blackout would normally have been expected anyway. A detail ground controllers noticed immediately, even though they had no way yet of knowing what it meant. Despite everything happening inside, the capsule itself worked exactly as it was supposed to on the outside. Its parachutes deployed correctly. It descended at a normal speed. It touched down in a remote part of Kazakhstan, looking, from the outside, like a completely successful landing. A Soviet recovery team rushed to the capsule, expecting to greet 3 tired but triumphant cosmonauts returning from a record-breaking mission. Instead, they knocked on the hatch and heard nothing back. When they finally got the hatch open, they found all 3 men inside, motionless. 2 of the crew members were already cold. The third still had some warmth left, and the recovery team attempted CPR on the spot, footage of which was only declassified and shown to the public many years later. Their efforts did not work. Georgy Dobrovolsky, Vladislav Volkov, and Viktor Patsayev were gone. Soviet state media handled the aftermath carefully, focusing public coverage almost entirely on the mission's genuine scientific accomplishments, rather than the exact cause of the crew's deaths. For nearly 2 years, Soviet officials did not publicly disclose the specific technical reason the cosmonauts had died, a silence that created real anxiety on the other side of the world. NASA was in the middle of preparing its own long-duration space station program, Skylab, and without knowing whether the Soyuz 11 deaths had resulted from a mechanical failure or from some previously unknown danger tied to spending several weeks in weightlessness, American space officials could not be entirely sure their own upcoming astronauts would be safe. NASA's own chief flight surgeon at the time, Dr. Charles Berry, remained convinced that simply spending several weeks in microgravity could not by itself be fatal, and in the absence of an official Soviet explanation, he theorized that the crew had likely died from breathing in some kind of toxic substance, an educated guess that turned out to be close in spirit, even though the actual cause was a loss of cabin pressure rather than contamination of the air itself. An investigation afterward traced the disaster back to that single valve and the explosive charges that jarred it open early. Soviet engineers proposed that a shock wave from the separation itself triggered the valve's mechanism prematurely, and even though repeated ground tests could never fully recreate the exact failure, this explanation became the official cause simply because there was no better alternative. In a grim experiment sometime after the accident, 2 experienced cosmonauts, Alexei Leonov and Nikolai Rukavishnikov, the very same Rukavishnikov who had lost consciousness from toxic fumes aboard the earlier Soyuz 10 flight, tried closing that same valve by hand, under calm, controlled conditions on the ground, already knowing exactly which valve to reach for and exactly how to close it. It took them 52 seconds. The actual crew of Soyuz 11, working the same valve while disoriented, in pain, and running out of air, with no advance warning of what was happening, never stood a real chance. It is worth understanding exactly why Soyuz 11 gets called the only spaceflight where humans died in space. Because other tragedies in the history of spaceflight, including the loss of Soyuz 1 4 years earlier and the losses of the American Challenger and Columbia shuttles decades later, all happened either during launch or while still inside Earth's atmosphere on the way back down. Soyuz 1's only crew member, Vladimir Komarov, died in 1967 when his capsule's parachute failed to deploy properly and it struck the ground, a disaster that unfolded low in the atmosphere, not above the internationally recognized boundary of space itself. Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev remain, to this day, the only human beings known to have died while genuinely above that line, more than 60 miles up, in the vacuum of space itself. News of the deaths shocked people on both sides of the Cold War. The Soviet government gave the 3 cosmonauts a full state funeral. Their bodies lay in state in Moscow, covered in flowers, while thousands of ordinary citizens filed past to pay their respects. After the funeral, their ashes were placed inside the Kremlin wall, an honor reserved for the country's most respected public figures, and each man was posthumously awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union. The United States sent Tom Stafford, at the time NASA's chief astronaut, and someone who had flown to the moon on Apollo 10 2 years earlier, to represent President Richard Nixon at the funeral. Soviet officials asked Stafford to serve as one of the pallbearers, a striking gesture given how tense relations between the 2 countries still were at that point in the Cold War. Nixon issued a public statement expressing the American people's sympathy for the tragedy and praising the cosmonauts' contribution to space exploration. That shared moment of grief ended up planting the seed for something unexpected. 4 years later, in July 1975, American and Soviet spacecraft docked together in orbit for the first time in history, a mission known as the Apollo-Soyuz Test Project. The two commanders chosen to lead that historic handshake in space were Tom Stafford and Alexei Leonov, the very same Leonov who had originally been scheduled to fly the ill-fated Soyuz 11 mission before doctors pulled him from the crew days before launch. Leonov's own would-be crewmate on that original Soyuz 11 assignment, Valery Kubasov, ended up flying the Apollo-Soyuz mission alongside him after an earlier, unrelated Soviet station mission the two men had been assigned to failed to even reach orbit. Stafford and Leonov went on to become close friends for the rest of their lives, a friendship that traced its roots directly back to the funeral of three men Leonov had almost flown alongside. The disaster permanently changed how Soyuz spacecraft were built. Soviet engineers redesigned the capsule to carry only 2 cosmonauts instead of 3, freeing up enough room for each crew member to wear a lightweight pressure suit, called a Sokol suit, during the 2 most dangerous parts of any flight, launch and re-entry. Because that redesign took longer than planners hoped, Salyut 1 itself ended up sitting empty in orbit for months afterward, with officials still holding out hope that a newly redesigned Soyuz might reach it before its fuel ran out. That never happened. By October 1971, Salyut 1 was nearly out of the propellant it needed to maintain a stable orbit, and Soviet controllers made the decision to fire its engines one final time and let the world's first space station burn up over the Pacific Ocean, its mission ending 175 days after launch. It would take until 1980, nearly a decade later, for Soviet engineers to develop a new version of the Soyuz capable of safely fitting 3 cosmonauts again, this time with all 3 wearing suits. Every Soyuz launched since Soyuz 11 has required its crew to wear pressure suits during launch and landing, a rule that exists entirely because of what happened to Dobrovolsky, Volkov, and Patsayev on their way home. What makes the Soyuz 11 disaster so difficult to sit with is not just that 3 men died, it is how close they came to making it home. They had already succeeded at everything the mission asked of them. They had lived aboard the first space station in human history, survived a fire, set a world endurance record, and were only minutes away from a parachute landing and a hero's welcome when a single valve, hidden underneath their seats, decided the rest of their story for them. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every disturbing moment from the history of spaceflight ends in tragedy on this scale. Some end with nothing more than a strange sound that nobody could ever fully explain, heard not by 3 men trained in the Soviet Union or the United States, but by a single astronaut flying alone on the very first crewed mission of an entirely different space program. Section 3. The Knocking Sound Inside Shenzhou. 5 China's road to putting a human being in space took decades to build. In 1955, a Chinese engineer named Xian Sui Shen, who had spent years working on rocket research in the United States, returned home and brought with him the technical knowledge that would eventually seed the country's own rocket program. From that starting point, it took China until 1999 to launch its first uncrewed Shenzhou test capsule, and 4 more years after that before anyone was willing to put a person inside one. By October 2003, China had completed 4 successful uncrewed test flights of the Shenzhou spacecraft. It was time to find out if the 5th flight could carry a person. The man chosen for that flight was Yang Liwei, a 38-year-old lieutenant colonel in the People's Liberation Army. Before he ever thought about space, Yang had spent years as a fighter pilot, eventually logging more than 1,350 hours in the cockpit. In 1998, China selected 14 candidates from a pool of more than 1,500 applicants to begin training for a future crewed spaceflight program. Yang was one of them. For the next 5 years, he and the other candidates studied spacecraft systems and pushed their bodies through the same kind of physical and psychological training American and Soviet astronauts had gone through decades earlier. None of them knew, until almost the very last moment, which one of them would actually get to fly. The original plan for this mission called for 2 astronauts to spend a full week in orbit together. That plan changed after the American space shuttle Columbia broke apart during re-entry in February 2003, killing all 7 astronauts aboard. Watching that disaster unfold, Chinese mission planners scaled their own first crewed flight down dramatically, cutting it from 2 astronauts and 7 days to a single astronaut and about 1 day. 3 finalists were still in contention right up until the night before launch. Yang Liwei, Nie Haisheng, and Zhai Jigang all trained as if any one of them might be the one to fly. The final decision came down to a secret ballot cast by a small group of army generals overseeing the program. Held the evening before liftoff, Yang won that vote. He did not find out he had been chosen until October 14th, 1 day before the rocket was set to launch. On October 15, 2003, Yang Liwei lifted off from the Jiuquan Satellite Launch Center, a launch base sitting in the middle of the Gobi Desert in northwest China. He rode into space aboard a Long March 2F rocket, sealed inside the Shenzhou 5 capsule, wearing a pressure suit for the entire flight. About 2 minutes into the climb, the rocket began shaking in a way nobody had fully prepared him for. Engineers later identified the cause as pogo oscillation, a repeating vibration that can build up inside a rocket's fuel system during ascent. Yang described the sensation afterward as very uncomfortable, and by some accounts, the shaking was severe enough that he genuinely feared the vehicle around him might be coming apart before he ever reached orbit. The vibrations passed. The rocket continued climbing normally, and less than 10 minutes after liftoff, the spacecraft separated cleanly from the rocket's second stage and entered orbit roughly 343 kilometers above Earth. China had just become the 3rd country in history, after the Soviet Union and the United States, with the ability to launch a human being into space using its own technology. Once safely in orbit, Yang radioed down to mission control with a simple, calm message, telling ground controllers he was feeling well. For the next several hours, his mission followed a simple rhythm built entirely around one goal, proving that a person could survive the trip and come home safely. He circled the Earth once every 90 minutes, watching the planet's surface scroll past his window 14 times in total before his flight was scheduled to end. He ate his first meal in orbit within a couple of hours of reaching space, and later settled in for a scheduled rest period. There were no other astronauts on board to talk to, no crew to double-check what he was seeing or hearing. Whatever happened during those 21 hours, Yang was the only human being available to notice it, investigate it, and decide how seriously to take it. At some point during the flight, in the sealed quiet of the capsule, Yang started hearing a sound he could not place. He later described it in a television interview as sounding exactly like someone striking an iron bucket with a wooden hammer, a sharp, repeating knock that came and went without warning. It did not sound like static or the low hum of onboard equipment. It sounded like an impact, the kind of noise you would expect if something outside the spacecraft had physically struck it. Yang's first instinct was to investigate the way any trained pilot would. He looked out through the capsule's small window, checking for any sign of debris, damage, or anything unusual near the spacecraft. He found nothing. He checked his instrument panel and the pressure readings for the cabin, both of which showed everything operating normally. He inspected what he could see of the capsule's interior panels, looking for any obvious mechanical source for the noise. The knocking continued anyway, appearing and disappearing at intervals throughout parts of the flight, with no clear pattern he could identify from inside the capsule. Space is a vacuum, meaning there is no air to carry sound waves the way there is on Earth, which made the whole situation even harder to make sense of. A sound that seemed to be coming from outside the spacecraft should not, by the basic physics of a vacuum, have been able to reach him at all unless it was actually traveling through the metal structure of the capsule itself. Even though he never found a source for the noise, Yang stayed focused on his mission. He continued running through his checklist of tasks, monitoring the spacecraft systems, and preparing for re-entry, treating the sound as something to note rather than something to panic over. By the time his 21-hour flight was coming to an end, the knocking had not caused any damage, triggered any equipment failure, or interfered with any part of the mission. Whatever it was, it appeared to be harmless, even if it was completely unexplained. Before later Chinese astronauts flew their own missions, Yang reportedly gave them a heads-up about what to expect, telling the newer crews not to be alarmed if they heard a similar knocking sound during their own flights. That single piece of advice turned out to matter. Astronauts flying aboard Shenzhou 6 in 2005 and Shenzhou 7 in 2008, both later Chinese missions, independently reported hearing the same kind of knocking sound during their own time in orbit. The fact that separate crews, on separate spacecraft, years apart, described the same specific sound made it much harder to write off as one pilot's imagination or a single equipment fluke. Yang's flight ended on October 16, 2003, when the Shenzhou 5 capsule re-entered Earth's atmosphere and landed in the grasslands of Inner Mongolia, touching down just 4.8 kilometers from its planned landing site. He climbed out of the capsule under his own power about 15 minutes after landing and was met by recovery teams and, soon after, congratulations from China's premier. Photographs from the recovery showed Yang with visibly bleeding lips, which led to persistent rumors that the landing had been rougher than officials publicly admitted. Rumors that were later supported by accounts from personnel who were present at the recovery site. Regardless of how hard the actual touchdown was, Yang had accomplished what he set out to do. He had proven, with his own body, that a person could survive a Chinese-built and Chinese-launched spacecraft from liftoff through landing. Once he was back on the ground, engineers wanted answers about the knocking sound just as much as the public did. A full inspection of the returned capsule found no evidence of impact damage, no cracks, dents, or scorch marks that would explain a physical strike from outside. There was no proof that a piece of space debris, even something microscopic, had ever hit the spacecraft. That ruled out the most straightforward explanation, but it left engineers needing another one. The theory that gained the most traction pointed to temperature. A spacecraft in low Earth orbit passes in and out of direct sunlight roughly every 45 minutes, swinging between intense heat on the sunlit side and extreme cold in Earth's shadow. Materials expand when they heat up and contract when they cool down, and engineers proposed that this constant swing in temperature could cause tiny, sudden shifts in the capsule's structure, changes small enough not to show up as damage, but large enough to produce an audible knock as metal settled into a slightly different shape. A related theory focused on air pressure rather than temperature directly, suggesting that shifting pressure differences between the capsule's inner and outer walls, driven by those same temperature swings, caused microscopic deformations in the hull material, and that those tiny structural shifts were what Yang was actually hearing. Other engineers pointed instead toward the spacecraft's own internal hardware, suggesting that valves, pressure systems, reaction wheels, or small thruster components firing to adjust the capsule's orientation could produce a knock-like sound as they operated. None of these explanations were ever definitively proven. No single test after the flight was able to recreate the exact sound Yang described under controlled conditions and match it to one specific cause with certainty. What did happen, years later, added an unexpected piece of supporting evidence from an entirely different source. A Chinese scientist named Liu Hong, who helped design a sealed life support testing facility called Lunar Palace 1, revealed that researchers conducting a 105-day sealed test inside that facility, on the ground, with no connection to actual spaceflight, also heard the same kind of knocking sound during their time inside. She said the people inside the facility thought someone was knocking from outside, but no one was ever found. If a sealed, pressurized environment sitting safely on Earth can produce the same mysterious knock that astronauts reported in orbit, it strongly suggests the cause has something to do with how sealed capsules react to pressure and temperature changes in general, rather than anything unique to being in space. It does not, however, prove exactly which mechanism is responsible, and to this day, no official, fully confirmed explanation has ever been published. What makes this story different from other strange sounds reported during spaceflight is how it repeated itself. A single astronaut hearing an odd noise once could reasonably be chalked up to an isolated equipment issue, coincidence, or the ordinary unfamiliar sounds of a completely new piece of hardware performing exactly as designed. 3 separate crews, flying 3 separate missions over 5 years, all describing the same specific knocking sound, is a much harder pattern to dismiss. Whatever is happening inside a Shenzhou capsule in orbit, it appears to be a real and repeatable side effect of something about how the spacecraft is built or how it behaves in the space environment, even though nobody has been able to say for certain exactly what that something is. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. A knock with no clear cause, heard by more than one person, in more than one spacecraft, over multiple years, sits in a strange place between a solved mystery and an unsolved one. It is close enough to being explained that nobody at NASA or the China Manned Space Agency considers it dangerous, yet far enough from being fully understood that engineers still cannot point to one confirmed mechanical cause and call the case closed. Not every unexplained sound from a spaceflight gets resolved this cleanly, though. 2 American astronauts, flying together nearly 40 years earlier, would report seeing something out their window that neither mission control nor the men themselves were fully prepared to explain in the moment. A sighting captured on an open radio channel that the whole world could hear. Section 4. Gemini 7's bogey at 10 o'clock high. By late 1965, NASA's Gemini program was racing against a very specific deadline. President Kennedy had promised the country a moon landing before the end of the decade. And to get there, engineers needed to prove that astronauts could survive in space long enough to make the trip, and that 2 separate spacecraft could find each other and fly in close formation while orbiting the Earth. Gemini 7 was built to answer both questions at once. Its main job was to keep 2 astronauts alive and functioning in a tiny capsule for 14 straight days, roughly the length of time a round trip to the moon and back was expected to take. Its second job came almost by accident. Gemini 7 was not originally supposed to launch before Gemini 6. That changed when the uncrewed target vehicle Gemini 6 needed for its own rendezvous test exploded shortly after launch. With no target left for Gemini 6 to chase, NASA flipped the schedule, moving Gemini 7 up so it could launch first and then serve as a live, crewed target for a newly rebuilt Gemini 6A to catch up with in orbit. A handful of small additions had to be bolted onto Gemini 7 to make this work, including a radar transponder and extra lights so the approaching spacecraft could actually spot it in the dark. What had started as a straightforward endurance mission suddenly became the first attempt in history to bring 2 crewed spacecraft together in orbit. The 2 men assigned to fly this mission were Frank Borman and Jim Lovell, both 37 years old, both members of NASA's second group of astronauts, and both flying in space for the very first time. Borman was a West Point graduate and Air Force major with a background in engineering and flight testing. Lovell was a Naval Academy graduate and Navy lieutenant commander with an equally strong record as a test pilot. Their backup crew, in case anything happened before launch, was Ed White and Michael Collins, both of whom would go on to fly their own historic Apollo missions. Borman and Lovell trained together for months, learning the specific skills this flight would require, from station-keeping maneuvers to figuring out how to store 2 weeks of trash inside a cabin barely big enough for the two of them. Gemini 7 launched from Cape Canaveral on December 4, 1965, at 2:30 in the afternoon. The launch went smoothly, with only a slight vibration during ascent that Borman described feeling faintly, and Lovell said he did not notice at all. Within minutes, the spacecraft settled into an orbit roughly 300 kilometers above Earth. What followed was, in Borman's own words years later, a tough go. He compared the interior of the Gemini capsule to being smaller than the front seat of a Volkswagen Bug, a comparison he made only half-jokingly, since the two men would spend the next 14 days essentially shoulder to shoulder, doing absolutely everything in front of each other. Eating, sleeping, changing suits, and using the bathroom all happened in the same cramped space, in full view of the other person, because there was nowhere else to go. At one point, Lovell lost his toothbrush, and for the rest of the mission, the two men simply shared Borman's. Part of the mission involved testing a new lightweight spacesuit, one NASA hoped would be more comfortable for long-duration flights than earlier, bulkier designs. In practice, the suit still proved uncomfortable to wear for extended stretches in the Gemini capsule's cramped, overheated cabin. A few days into the flight, the crew began experimenting with taking their suits off entirely and flying in ordinary flight coveralls instead, swapping back into the suits only when a specific test or the rendezvous with Gemini 6A required it. This shirt-sleeve environment, as NASA called it, turned out to be far more livable, and both men spent the majority of the 2-week mission without their suits on at all. The middle stretch of the flight settled into a slow, repetitive rhythm. The excitement of launch had worn off, and the rendezvous with Gemini 6A was still days away. Borman and Lovell ran through scheduled experiments, monitored their spacecraft systems, and passed long hours of downtime reading paperback books they had brought along. Borman working through Mark Twain's Roughing It, and Lovell reading Drums Along the Mohawk. Not everything went smoothly. Several of the spacecraft's small maneuvering thrusters began failing partway through the mission, a problem later traced back to an outdated type of material used inside the thrust chambers. Around the same time, the spacecraft's fuel cells, which generated electrical power, started producing less energy than expected, forcing the crew to lean more heavily on the ship's backup batteries to make it through the rest of the flight. None of these problems ended up threatening the mission, but they added a layer of real mechanical strain to what was already a grueling stretch of confinement. It was during this same period, more than a week into their time in orbit, that Borman and Lovell had a front-row seat to something happening far below them. On their 31st orbit of the Earth, the crew watched the underwater launch of a Polaris missile fired from the submarine USS Benjamin Franklin off the coast of Florida, tracking its exhaust trail as it climbed away from the ocean's surface. It was the kind of moment that captured exactly what Gemini 7 was capable of doing, giving two men in orbit a clear view of a major military test happening thousands of miles below them. Not long after that missile observation, Borman keyed his radio and said something to Houston that had nothing to do with the mission's flight plan. He reported a bogey at 10 o'clock high, using a military aviation term both he and the ground controllers would have instantly recognized from their years of flight experience. In aviation, a bogey is an unidentified aircraft or radar contact, something spotted but not yet confirmed as friendly, hostile, or explainable. Houston immediately radioed back, asking Borman to clarify whether he was describing the spent booster rocket that had helped launch Gemini 7 into orbit, since a discarded booster stage often continues flying nearby in a similar orbit for a while after separation, or whether this was something else entirely. Borman's answer left no room for ambiguity. He told Houston they had debris up there, and that this was an actual sighting, deliberately separating what he was describing from the ordinary, expected booster debris that ground control might have assumed he meant. As the conversation continued, both astronauts added more detail. Borman and Lovell described seeing what looked like enormous numbers of tiny particles, at different points guessing the amount at somewhere between millions and trillions, drifting near the spacecraft a few miles away. Lovell specifically mentioned a single bright object that appeared to be tumbling as it moved. This was not a brief, half-second glance out the window. The exchange stretched on long enough and involved specific enough detail that both men clearly felt they were describing something real and worth documenting for the people on the ground, rather than a fleeting trick of the light they could shrug off in half a sentence. For decades, this exchange sat quietly in NASA's own flight records and mission transcripts, largely unnoticed outside of space history circles. That changed in 2026, when the Pentagon released more than 160 previously classified files connected to what the government now calls unidentified anomalous phenomena, the modern term that has replaced the older label UFO in most official use. Among those newly surfaced documents was a 4-page NASA public affairs record from the Gemini 7 mission, describing the same exchange between Borman, Lovell, and Houston. The document frames part of the conversation as commentary on an unidentified object, while also directly referencing the known booster debris that had been expected to be visible near the spacecraft. Handwritten notes attached to versions of this file reportedly labeled the sighting for internal reference, treating it as a real, documented event worth tracking rather than dismissing outright. None of this means NASA, then or now, believes Borman and Lovell saw anything otherworldly. Aerospace historians and NASA officials have pointed out for years that a huge number of early spaceflight sightings like this one, across many different missions, eventually turned out to have ordinary explanations. Tiny ice crystals venting from a spacecraft's cooling or waste systems can catch sunlight and appear to sparkle or tumble exactly like a cloud of unknown particles. Pieces of insulation, paint flecks, or small bits of hardware that separate from a booster rocket can drift alongside a spacecraft for hours, catching the sun at different angles as they spin. Borman himself, discussing the flight afterward, was straightforward about what he believed he had seen, describing it as debris connected to the mission rather than anything unexplainable, and never suggested in later interviews that the event pointed to anything beyond ordinary orbital junk lit up by the sun. What makes the Gemini 7 sighting different from a lot of other space oddities is not the explanation, which lines up with plenty of similar, well-understood cases from the same era. What makes it stand out is the transcript itself, a real-time, word-for-word radio exchange between two trained military pilots and a room full of flight controllers, recorded as it happened rather than described second-hand years later. Borman's clipped, matter-of-fact radio call, followed immediately by Houston's direct question about whether this was the booster or something else, captures a moment of genuine uncertainty playing out live, with nobody involved sure yet what they were actually looking at. That kind of raw, unfiltered exchange is rare, and it is part of why this specific sighting still gets pulled out of the archives and re-examined more than half a century later. Whatever those particles and that tumbling object actually were, they did not slow the mission down. A few days after the sighting, the real centerpiece of Gemini 7's flight finally arrived. On December 15th, after 3 days of delays caused by an earlier engine malfunction, Gemini 6A launched carrying astronauts Wally Schirra and Tom Stafford. Their job was to chase down Gemini 7, using a careful sequence of engine burns to close a gap of more than 600 nautical miles, gradually catching up in altitude, speed, and position until the two spacecraft were flying in formation together. It worked. Gemini 6A closed the distance in stages, first cutting the gap to roughly 260 nautical miles, then picking up Gemini 7 on radar from over 200 nautical miles away, before finally pulling to within about 1 foot of Borman and Lovell's spacecraft. The two capsules were never designed to physically dock with each other, but for a short period, 4 American astronauts flew close enough in orbit to see each other clearly through their windows, the first time in history 2 crewed spacecraft had ever managed anything like it. 3 days after that historic rendezvous, with their fuel running low and their batteries nearly drained, Borman and Lovell brought Gemini 7 home, splashing down in the western Atlantic Ocean on December 18, 1965, recovered by the aircraft carrier USS Wasp. They had spent nearly 14 days in space and completed 206 orbits of the Earth, setting a spaceflight endurance record that would stand until a Soviet crew broke it nearly 5 years later, and a record for the longest American spaceflight that held until Skylab in 1973. Both men walked away from the mission as 2 of the most experienced astronauts in the entire American space program, and both went on to even more famous chapters in spaceflight history. Frank Borman would command Apollo 8 3 years later, becoming one of the first 3 human beings to orbit the Moon. Jim Lovell would go on to fly Apollo 13, the mission that turned into one of the most dramatic survival stories in the history of American spaceflight. The strangeness of the Gemini 7 bogey sits in an odd space between the fully mysterious and the fully explained. Nobody who has studied the mission seriously believes Borman and Lovell encountered anything beyond ordinary orbital debris catching the sunlight at an unfamiliar angle. And yet the exact wording of that radio exchange, an experienced military pilot calling out a bogey at 10 o'clock high, insisting to Houston that this was a real sighting and not just the expected booster, remains sitting in NASA's own official records, plainly audible to anyone who goes looking for it. Sometimes the most unsettling detail in a story is not what actually happened. It is how calmly 2 men, further from home than almost anyone alive at the time, described watching something they could not immediately identify, then went right back to running their checklist. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Musgrave described watching something drifting alongside the shuttle that by every rule of physics he understood should not have looked the way it looked. He would later say it appeared white, elongated, somewhere between 6 and 8 feet long, and moving with what looked like its own internal motion, almost like it was swimming, rather than simply tumbling in zero gravity the way ordinary debris does. He noticed it once. Then, on a separate mission, he noticed it again. Section 5. Story Musgrave's Space Eel. Long before Story Musgrave ever wore a NASA badge, his life had already taken a path that looked nothing like the typical astronaut biography. He was born in Boston in 1935, but grew up on a farm near Stockbridge, Massachusetts, in a childhood he later described as difficult and unstable. He found steadiness in physical work instead, learning to operate and repair tractors, trucks, and farm machinery from an early age. At 18, without having finished high school, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps in 1953. Over the following years, he served as an aviation electrician, an instrument technician, and an aircraft crew chief, completing duty assignments in Korea, Japan, Hawaii, and aboard the aircraft carrier USS Wasp in the Far East. It was during this military service, working around aircraft every day, that he first learned to fly. After leaving the Marine Corps, Musgrave began an academic career that would eventually become one of the most unusual in NASA's history. He earned a bachelor's degree in mathematics and statistics from Syracuse University in 1958, then worked briefly as a mathematician for the Eastman Kodak Company before returning to school. He added a master's degree in operations analysis and computer programming from UCLA, then a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Marietta College. then a Doctor of Medicine degree from Columbia University in 1964. After finishing medical school, he completed a surgical internship at the University of Kentucky Medical Center, then stayed on for postdoctoral research fellowships funded by the Air Force and the National Heart Institute, studying cardiovascular and exercise physiology, which earned him a master's degree in physiology and biophysics in 1966. Decades later, in 1987, while already a veteran astronaut, he added a sixth and final degree, a master's degree in literature. Few people who have ever flown in space arrived with a resume built from mathematics, chemistry, medicine, physiology, and literature all at once. NASA selected Musgrave in August 1967 as part of a new kind of astronaut group, one built specifically from scientists rather than exclusively from military test pilots, which had been the only real pathway into the astronaut corps up to that point. After completing the required academic and flight training, Musgrave spent years working directly on hardware other astronauts would eventually rely on for their lives. He helped design the Skylab program systems and served as backup science pilot for the first Skylab mission. He also played a central role in developing the Space Shuttle's entire extravehicular activity system, including spacesuits, life support equipment, airlocks, and the jetpack-style manned maneuvering unit astronauts used to move freely in space without a tether. By the time he finally launched into orbit himself, Musgrave had already spent more than 15 years helping build the very equipment that would keep him alive. His first spaceflight came on STS-6, the maiden voyage of the Space Shuttle Challenger, launched on April 4, 1983. During that mission, Musgrave and fellow astronaut Don Peterson performed the first spacewalk ever conducted from a space shuttle, testing the new suits and equipment Musgrave himself had helped design. 2 years later, in July 1985, he flew again on STS-51F, a Spacelab mission that carried 13 major scientific experiments focused on astronomy, astrophysics, and life sciences, with Musgrave serving as systems engineer during launch and entry, and as a pilot during the mission's science operations. His third flight, STS-33, in November 1989, was a classified mission flown for the United States Department of Defense, launching at night and landing 5 days later at Edwards Air Force Base in California. His fourth mission, STS-44, also launched at night in November 1991, with the primary goal of deploying a defense satellite along with its booster rocket. Musgrave's fifth flight, STS-61, in December 1993, became one of the most important missions of his career and of the entire Space Shuttle program. Endeavour launched at night, rendezvoused with the Hubble Space Telescope, and over an 11-day mission, 2 pairs of astronauts conducted a record 5 spacewalks to fix a flaw in Hubble's main mirror that had been blurring its images since its launch 3 years earlier. Musgrave performed 3 of those 5 spacewalks, becoming the first astronaut physician in history to conduct spacewalks across 2 separate missions. His sixth and final flight, STS-80, in November and December 1996, saw him help deploy and later retrieve 2 free-flying science satellites, one designed to grow ultra-pure semiconductor material in the vacuum trailing behind it, the other built to study the light coming from distant stars. That mission set a record for the most orbits completed on a single shuttle flight, and made Musgrave, at 61 years old, the oldest human being to have flown in space at that point, a record that stood until John Glenn returned to orbit 2 years later. Across those 6 missions, Musgrave logged more than 1,281 hours in space and became the only astronaut in history to fly aboard all 5 operational space shuttles: Columbia, Challenger, Discovery, Atlantis, and Endeavour. It was against this background, a background built on rigorous science, direct hands-on engineering knowledge of shuttle hardware, and more spaceflight experience than almost anyone else who has ever left Earth, that Musgrave described something during 2 of his 6 missions, years apart, that he never fully explained to his own satisfaction. In August 1994, in an interview with Omni magazine, Musgrave explained where he believed most unusual sightings near a shuttle actually came from. He described how all kinds of debris naturally comes off a spacecraft, especially near the back end after the main engines shut down and various hatches and doors open, releasing ice chips, traces of leftover oxygen or hydrogen, and other small bits of material that get dumped from the engine system during normal operation. Then he described one specific object that stood out from all the rest. He said that on 2 separate flights he had seen and photographed what he called the snake, comparing it to a 7-foot-long eel swimming just outside the shuttle. He speculated that it might have been a rubber seal that had come loose from the main engines, explaining that in zero gravity, a piece of material like that would be completely free to move in any direction, rippling with what he called its own internal waves, giving it the appearance of swimming under its own power, rather than simply drifting or tumbling the way ordinary debris usually does. A year later, in 1995, Musgrave described the same experience again, this time on camera, in an interview for a television documentary series called Sightings. His description barely changed from what he had told Omni the year before. He said that on 2 of his missions, he still did not have an answer for what he had seen, describing an object somewhere between 6 and 8 feet long, rubbery in texture because of the way it rippled with internal motion, and noted that it stayed near the shuttle and followed alongside it for a noticeably long stretch of time, rather than simply flashing past the window and disappearing. According to accounts from people connected to NASA at the time, this television appearance was the first many of his own colleagues and NASA officials had heard of the sighting at all. Musgrave had never filed any official report describing it after either mission, choosing instead to mention it publicly for the first time on a documentary years later. This gap between what Musgrave described and what actually exists in any official NASA record is important to be honest about. What can be verified with real confidence is that Musgrave, a physician, mathematician, and one of the most experienced astronauts NASA has ever had, described the same basic object in nearly the same specific terms on 2 separate public occasions a year apart, without changing the core details of his account. What cannot be verified is the object itself. There is no mission transcript of him reporting it to Houston in real time. No onboard shuttle footage of the object has ever been released publicly. No other astronaut on either flight has gone on record confirming they saw the same thing Musgrave described. The photographs he mentioned taking have never been widely published or independently examined. This does not mean Musgrave invented the story. It means the sighting exists in the space between a credible witness's account and anything resembling independent, verifiable proof. The explanation Musgrave himself offered lines up cleanly with known engineering realities of the Space Shuttle program, rather than requiring anything beyond ordinary physics. Rubber seals and gaskets were a standard part of the shuttle's main engine assembly, used to maintain pressure and prevent leaks in various fuel and coolant lines. It was well documented across the shuttle program that small pieces of hardware, insulation, ice, and other loose material regularly detached from a shuttle after main engine shutdown, particularly around the engine compartment at the rear of the vehicle. A rubber seal working itself loose and drifting free near the shuttle would not have been an unusual event by itself. What makes an object like that look strange is entirely about the environment it ends up floating in. On Earth, gravity and air resistance shape how almost everything around us moves, pulling objects down in predictable arcs and slowing spinning or twisting motion fairly quickly. In zero gravity, none of those forces apply. A flexible object like a rubber seal, once free of its housing, has nothing pulling it in any particular direction and nothing damping its motion. It can flex, twist, and ripple continuously in ways that would look completely mundane if you understood exactly what you were looking at from an engineering diagram, but could look genuinely alive if you were seeing it for the first time, framed against the total blackness of space and lit directly by unfiltered sunlight with no atmosphere to soften the glare. A rippling strip of rubber under those specific lighting and gravity conditions could very plausibly look exactly like something swimming. What makes this particular account worth remembering is not that it proves anything unexplainable took place outside the shuttle's window. It is that one of the most rigorously trained, most scientifically credentialed human beings to ever leave Earth, a man with 6 academic degrees spanning mathematics, chemistry, medicine, and physiology, someone who had personally helped design the very hardware that could produce debris like this, looked at the same basic shape twice, years apart, and reached for the word snake both times, all while offering his own calm, technically plausible explanation in the very same breath. Even the most qualified, most rational observer available to NASA did not need an extraordinary answer to be genuinely unsettled by an ordinary one. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every strange experience reported by astronauts involves something drifting outside a window that can, at least in theory, be explained by debris or lighting. Some of the strangest sensations described by people who have flown in space happen with their eyes completely shut, in total darkness, when there is nothing outside the spacecraft to look at all, and the mystery is happening entirely inside their own body. Section 6. Cosmic rays passing through an astronaut's eye. The first person to formally describe this experience was Buzz Aldrin, during the debriefing sessions held after the Apollo 11 mission returned from the Moon in July 1969. Aldrin told NASA investigators that during the flight, once his eyes had adjusted to the darkness of the spacecraft cabin, he began noticing brief flashes and streaks of light, even when his eyes were completely closed. These were not the ordinary shapes and colors a person's eyes sometimes produce in total darkness on Earth. Aldrin described them clearly enough, and specifically enough, that NASA researchers could not simply write the experience off as imagination or fatigue. Neil Armstrong, flying alongside him on that same mission, reported the same basic sensation. This was not a one-time report from a single flight. Astronauts on the following 2 missions, Apollo 12 and Apollo 13, independently described the same kind of flashes, without having been specifically told in advance to look for them. 3 separate crews, on 3 separate trips beyond low Earth orbit, all came back describing pinpoints, thin streaks, or small clouds of light appearing in total darkness, almost always without any color, and often noticeable enough to interrupt an astronaut's attempt to fall asleep. Once NASA recognized this was a consistent, repeatable pattern rather than an isolated fluke, it stopped being an amusing anecdote and became a genuine subject for scientific investigation. NASA's first formal step was fairly simple. On later Apollo missions, astronauts were asked to wear blindfolds during scheduled observation periods and verbally report every flash they noticed in real time, giving researchers on the ground a clearer, more structured record of how often the flashes occurred and what they looked like. This approach confirmed that the experience was common and fairly frequent, but it still could not answer the most important question, which was what was actually causing it. Simply asking astronauts to describe what they saw could not, by itself, prove anything about the physical cause behind the sensation. To get a real answer, NASA needed a way to connect what an astronaut reported seeing with an actual, measurable physical event happening at the exact same moment. On the final 2 Apollo missions, Apollo 16 and Apollo 17, engineers equipped 1 astronaut on each flight with a specialized piece of hardware called the Apollo Light Flash Moving Emulsion Detector, often shortened to ALFMED. This device was worn on the astronaut's head during dark periods of the mission, and it used layered photographic emulsion, a material sensitive enough to record the physical path of a high-energy particle as it passed through. If a cosmic ray or another charged particle physically passed through or near the detector while it was being worn, the device would record the exact track that particle had taken. The experiment worked by having the astronaut wear the ALFMED device for roughly an hour at a time, while reporting every flash of light they noticed, exactly as they experienced it, in real time. Researchers could then go back afterward and compare the timing of each reported flash against the recorded particle tracks, checking whether a real, physical particle had actually passed through or near the eye at the same moment the astronauts said they saw something. On Apollo 17 specifically, the astronaut wearing the device reported 17 separate flashes during the session. When researchers cross-checked those reports against the detector's recorded data, 2 of those 17 flashes lined up precisely with the track of a heavy cosmic ray nucleus passing directly through the astronaut's eye. Across both missions combined, researchers found that 2 out of 15 total recorded particle tracks matched up with a flash the astronaut had reported experiencing at that same moment. On its own, a match rate like that might not sound overwhelming. What made it convincing was everything else surrounding it. Researchers combined those direct matches with detailed calculations about the geometry of the human eye, the size and shape of the structures a particle would need to pass through to trigger a visual sensation, and statistical modeling estimating how often a particle should be expected to pass through that specific area purely by chance. Taken together, all of that evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. The flashes astronauts were describing were being caused by actual, physical cosmic ray particles traveling directly through their eyes or the surrounding tissue, not by imagination, fatigue, or any kind of psychological effect brought on by isolation or stress. Individual accounts from the Apollo astronauts added detail to the more clinical data. On Apollo 15, all 3 crew members aboard reported experiencing the same phenomenon, with astronaut James Irwin memorably describing what he saw as a brilliant streak across the retina, a description that lines up closely with what the ALFMED data would later confirm was physically happening. Not every astronaut experienced the flashes equally. Ken Mattingly, the command module pilot on Apollo 16 who took part in the formal light flash experiments, was the one notable exception among the astronauts studied, reporting that he did not personally notice the flashes at all, which he attributed to having relatively poor night vision compared to his crewmates. On the lunar missions overall, once an astronaut's eyes had properly adjusted to the darkness, researchers found the flashes occurred at an average rate of roughly 1 every 2.9 minutes, frequent enough to become a genuine and repeated annoyance for astronauts specifically trying to fall asleep during their scheduled rest periods. Understanding why this happens at all starts with understanding exactly what a cosmic ray actually is. Cosmic rays are extremely high-energy particles, mostly protons but sometimes heavier atomic nuclei, that are flung across the universe by some of the most powerful astrophysical events known to exist, including exploding stars and other extreme cosmic phenomena far outside our own solar system. These particles travel through space at tremendous speeds, carrying enormous amounts of energy packed into something smaller than an atom. Here on the surface of the Earth, we are shielded from almost all of this radiation by 2 things working together: a thick atmosphere that absorbs and deflects the vast majority of incoming particles, and Earth's own magnetic field, which redirects many charged particles away from the surface entirely. Astronauts traveling beyond low Earth orbit, and to a lesser extent, astronauts flying inside low Earth orbit itself, lose most of that protection. A spacecraft's hull provides some shielding, but nowhere near as much as Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field combined, which means a meaningful number of these high-energy particles reach the crew directly. When one of these particles happens to pass through the exact right area, whether that means the retina at the back of the eye, the optic nerve, or even certain visual processing regions of the brain itself, it can trigger a burst of activity that the brain interprets as a genuine flash of light, even though no actual external light source produced it. Exactly how this happens at a biological level remains a subject of real scientific debate, even decades after the Apollo missions first identified the phenomenon. One leading explanation holds that when a cosmic ray physically strikes light-sensitive cells in the retina, it directly stimulates those cells in a way similar to how ordinary visible light normally would, tricking the visual system into registering a flash that never actually existed as external light. Another competing explanation focuses on something called the Cherenkov effect, a phenomenon where a charged particle moving faster than the speed of light travels specifically through a dense medium, such as the gel-like fluid that fills the inside of the eye, since light itself moves more slowly through that fluid than it does through a vacuum. Under the right conditions, a particle moving faster than that internal speed limit can actually generate a real, physical burst of visible light directly inside the eye, meaning the astronaut would, in a very literal sense, actually be seeing genuine photons, just ones created inside their own eyeball by a particle from deep space, rather than arriving from any external source. A third possibility researchers have considered is that some particles may bypass the eye almost entirely and stimulate visual processing regions of the brain directly, since a fast-moving, sufficiently energetic particle does not necessarily need to pass through the eye specifically to disrupt the neural pathways responsible for interpreting vision. More than 50 years after Aldrin's original report, researchers still have not definitively settled which of these mechanisms, or what combination of them, is primarily responsible. This phenomenon did not stop happening once the Apollo program ended. Astronauts aboard the Skylab space station in the 1970s reported the same kind of flashes, as did cosmonauts and astronauts living aboard the Russian Mir space station in the years that followed. Crew members on the International Space Station continue to report the same experience today, describing it in almost identical terms to what Aldrin first described back in 1969. NASA astronaut Don Pettit, who has spent extended periods aboard the ISS, has spoken and written extensively about experiencing these flashes himself, and has documented how their frequency changes depending on exactly where the station happens to be in its orbit. Over a specific region of the South Atlantic Ocean, an area known as the South Atlantic Anomaly, where a weak spot in Earth's magnetic field allows more radiation to reach lower altitudes than almost anywhere else on the planet, astronauts have reported the flashes increasing dramatically, from an occasional flash every several minutes to multiple flashes occurring every single minute while the station passes through that specific region. On missions that stayed within low Earth orbit, rather than traveling all the way to the Moon, researchers found the flashes still occurred, though somewhat less frequently, averaging around 1 every 6.8 minutes, compared to the roughly 1 every 2.9 minutes reported during the Apollo missions, a difference generally attributed to the greater radiation exposure that comes with leaving the added protection of Earth's magnetic field entirely. Confirming the physical cause behind these flashes turned this from a strange curiosity into a real subject of concern for anyone planning long-duration missions further out into the solar system. NASA's own 1970 report on the biomedical results of the Apollo program specifically noted that although the potential hazards from this kind of heavy, high-energy cosmic radiation had been recognized even before Apollo flew, very little serious research had actually been conducted into it until astronauts started reporting these light flashes directly. Once the reports were confirmed to have a real physical cause, they raised an uncomfortable follow-up question that researchers are still actively working to answer, which is whether particles capable of producing a visible flash by passing through delicate tissue in the eye might also be causing quieter, less immediately obvious effects elsewhere in the brain and nervous system. Effects that would not necessarily announce themselves the way a flash of light does. For short trips to the Moon or missions confined to Earth orbit like Skylab, later scientific reviews concluded that the overall radiation exposure involved did not appear to pose a serious health hazard on its own. For a future mission to Mars, which would expose a crew to significantly more time outside the protection of Earth's magnetic field, this remains an active and genuinely unresolved area of ongoing research. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that this particular mystery never needed an external object, a strange sound, or a fault in the spacecraft's equipment to be genuinely unsettling. Every single flash an Apollo, Skylab, Mir, or ISS astronaut has ever described happening in total darkness was produced by a piece of the universe itself, a particle flung out from some incomprehensibly distant, ancient, and violent cosmic event, crossing unimaginable distances only to end its journey by passing directly through a human eye. Unlike so many other unexplained sightings from the history of spaceflight, there was never any debris to recover, no equipment to inspect, and no footage to review. The evidence, quite literally, only existed for a fraction of a second inside the astronaut's own body. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Flashes of light are not the only sensation astronauts have reported experiencing without any visible external cause. Inside the sealed, recycled air of a space station orbiting hundreds of miles above Earth, astronauts have also described smelling things that, by every measurable standard, should not be there at all. Section 7. The smell of space astronauts cannot smell space directly. A human being, exposed to the true vacuum outside a spacecraft, would die almost immediately, long before any sense of smell could register anything at all. And yet, for more than 50 years, astronauts returning from spacewalks have consistently described smelling something the moment they step back inside and take off their helmets, a distinctive odor that clings to their suits, gloves, and tools. This is not one astronaut's imagination or a single strange anecdote. It is a pattern reported independently by astronauts from different countries, different space agencies, and different decades, all describing something remarkably similar without ever comparing notes beforehand. The pattern goes back to the Apollo program. Astronauts who walked on the Moon and handled lunar dust directly, then climbed back into the lunar module and removed their helmets, repeatedly commented on a distinct smell clinging to the dust that had collected on their suits, describing it as similar to spent gunpowder, an odor most of the Apollo crews immediately recognized from their own military and aviation backgrounds. This was not something anyone expected before the missions flew. Lunar soil, sitting in a vacuum for billions of years with no water or organic material anywhere near it, had no obvious reason to smell like anything. Yet the description showed up again and again, mission after mission, from crews who otherwise had no way of coordinating their answers with each other in advance. Decades later, astronauts flying aboard the Space Shuttle and the International Space Station began describing a very similar experience after conducting spacewalks. NASA astronaut Don Pettit, writing about the smell on a NASA blog after one of his missions, struggled to find an easy comparison for what he had experienced, ultimately settling on describing it as a rather pleasant, sweet, metallic sensation, one that reminded him specifically of the welding fumes he remembered from summers spent repairing heavy logging equipment as a younger man. Fellow NASA astronaut Greg Chamatoff described the exact same experience in his own words, noting that there was one smell up in orbit that was so unique and so consistently recognized among the crew that they had simply started calling it the smell of space. NASA astronaut Kevin Ford, describing the sensation from orbit in 2009, said it was unlike anything he had ever smelled before in his life, adding that he knew he would never forget it. Astronauts across multiple missions and multiple space agencies have echoed nearly identical language, describing the smell using comparisons to hot metal, spent gunpowder, seared steak, and burnt cake, an oddly specific and oddly consistent set of descriptions for something that, according to basic physics, should not exist at all in the vacuum of space. Understanding why this happens starts with understanding what astronauts can and cannot actually smell while they are outside the spacecraft. A spacesuit is a fully sealed, self-contained environment, supplying its own oxygen and maintaining its own internal pressure, completely separate from the vacuum surrounding it. While an astronaut is actually outside on a spacewalk, the air they breathe comes entirely from their suit's own life support system, which means anything happening in the vacuum outside has no direct path to their nose at all. The interior of the suit itself tends to smell faintly of plastic and rubber, and nothing more. It is only after the spacewalk ends, once the astronaut has climbed back inside, sealed the outer hatch, and allowed the airlock to fill back up with breathable air, that the smell actually appears, right as they remove their helmet for the first time since going outside. The leading scientific explanation for what is actually happening points to a form of oxygen most people never encounter directly. In the environment surrounding a space station or spacecraft in low Earth orbit, ultraviolet radiation from the sun can split ordinary oxygen molecules, which are normally made of two oxygen atoms bonded together, into individual, highly reactive single oxygen atoms. This atomic oxygen is not something you would ever run into on the surface of the Earth, where it barely exists outside of tightly controlled laboratory conditions, but it is genuinely abundant in the specific altitude range where spacewalks take place. During a spacewalk, these reactive single oxygen atoms can accumulate on the outer surface of an astronaut's suit, their gloves, and their tools, essentially clinging to everything exposed to the open environment for an extended period. When the astronaut climbs back inside and the airlock repressurizes with ordinary oxygen, those individual atoms suddenly have normal oxygen molecules available to react with again, and the two can combine to form ozone, a molecule made of 3 oxygen atoms instead of 2, known for producing a very distinct, sharp, metallic smell. Miranda Nelson, a spacewalk flight controller working in mission control at NASA's Johnson Space Center, has explained that this ozone formation is one of the leading candidates for at least part of what astronauts are smelling. Ozone alone does not fully explain every part of the smell astronauts describe, particularly the specific comparisons to seared meat and burnt cake that come up so consistently. A second theory focuses on a different class of molecule entirely, called polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, often shortened to PAHs. These are complex, carbon-based molecules that occur naturally in charred and burnt food here on Earth, which is part of why they are associated with smells like burnt toast or barbecued meat in everyday life. What makes PAHs relevant to spaceflight is that they are also remarkably common throughout the universe at large, making up a large share of all the carbon that exists in interstellar space. Because they are so widespread, PAHs can realistically end up clinging to the surface of a spacesuit or a piece of equipment during time spent outside a spacecraft, later reacting or off-gassing once that equipment returns to a normal, oxygen-rich environment inside the airlock. Nelson has described this particular explanation as the more unusual and more evocative of the two leading theories, noting that these same poo molecules are also directly connected to the explosive deaths of massive stars, meaning that, in a very real sense, Part of the smell astronauts describe after a spacewalk may trace back to material originally created by a star dying somewhere else in the galaxy. NASA has taken this phenomenon seriously enough to invest real resources into studying and even recreating it. The agency hired a professional chemist, Stephen Pierce, specifically to analyze and reproduce the smell of space here on Earth, with the goal of preparing astronauts in training so that the sensation would not catch them off guard the first time they experienced it for real. Pierce has suggested that part of the metallic character of the smell may come from high-energy vibrations occurring at the level of individual ions, adding another layer of legitimate chemistry to what might otherwise sound like an exaggerated astronaut anecdote. The fact that NASA considers this important enough to warrant a dedicated chemist and a formal training component says something about how consistent and how strong these reports have been across the astronaut corps over the decades. The chemistry connecting astronauts to the wider universe through smell does not stop with what clings to a spacesuit in low Earth orbit. Scientists studying the composition of interstellar gas clouds have identified specific molecules elsewhere in the galaxy that, if a person could somehow safely smell them, would produce recognizable and sometimes surprisingly pleasant aromas. One such molecule, ethyl formate, is the same chemical compound responsible for giving raspberries and rum their distinctive sweet smell here on Earth, and it has been detected in significant quantities in a massive gas cloud located near the center of the Milky Way galaxy. This does not mean an astronaut could ever safely travel there and take a sniff, but it illustrates a broader and genuinely fascinating point. The universe is full of specific, identifiable chemical compounds, many of which happen to correspond to smells the human nose already recognizes from ordinary life on Earth, whether that means the sweetness of rum, the char of a burnt steak, or the sharp bite of ozone. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that one of the most human, most primal senses a person has turns out to be one of the clearest windows into what astronauts are actually exposed to in space. Sight can be tricked by unfamiliar lighting and unfamiliar motion. Hearing depends entirely on a medium like air or metal to carry sound, something largely absent in a vacuum. Smell, by contrast, requires an actual physical molecule to reach the nose and interact directly with the body's own chemistry. When an astronaut removes their helmet and catches that unmistakable whiff of burnt metal, they are not imagining anything. They are, in a very real and very literal sense, smelling the physical residue of the space environment itself, carried back into the cabin, stuck to the surface of their own equipment. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every unexplained object encountered near a spacecraft turns out to require an explanation this complex. Sometimes, what looks like a complete mystery floating just outside a space station's window turns out to have a far simpler answer, one that an entire mission control room can trace back to a single, ordinary piece of hardware that was never supposed to go missing in the first place. Section 8. The Object. Chris Cassidy. Almost missed. Before Chris Cassidy ever put on a NASA badge, he had already spent 11 years as a United States Navy SEAL. Born in Salem, Massachusetts, in 1970, Cassidy graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1993 with a degree in mathematics, then went on to earn a master's degree in ocean engineering from MIT in 2000. In between those two degrees, he passed the notoriously grueling Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL training program and spent the following years deployed overseas, completing 2 tours in the Mediterranean and 2 more supporting combat operations in Afghanistan. During one 9-day operation at a cave complex on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, Cassidy led his unit through combat intense enough to earn him a Bronze Star with a Combat V device and a Presidential Unit Citation. By the time NASA selected him as an astronaut candidate in May 2004, Cassidy had already spent more than a decade operating in some of the most physically and mentally demanding environments the U.S. military has to offer. Cassidy's first trip to space came in July 2009, aboard the Space Shuttle Endeavour on a mission known as STS-127. During that flight, Cassidy became the 500th human being in history to travel into space, a milestone tied directly to the specific mission he happened to be flying, rather than anything about him personally, since NASA and other space agencies simply track the cumulative total of everyone who has ever flown. Over the course of that mission, Cassidy performed 3 separate spacewalks, helping install the final components of the Japanese experiment module, a major addition to the International Space Station, and helping replace batteries on one of the station's large truss structures. He returned to Earth after 15 days in space, having already proven himself as one of the most capable spacewalkers in the astronaut corps. Cassidy's second trip to space, in 2013, turned out to be one of the more eventful missions any astronaut has flown aboard the International Space Station in recent memory, filled with incidents that had nothing to do with anything supernatural and everything to do with the genuine, everyday hazards of operating machinery in orbit. He launched on March 28, 2013, aboard the Russian Soyuz TMA-08M spacecraft, as part of a crew that completed the first-ever expedited rendezvous with the station, reaching it in just 6 hours instead of the standard 2 days most Soyuz flights had previously required. Less than 2 months after arriving, on May 11th, Cassidy and fellow astronaut Thomas Marshburn had to conduct an unplanned, urgently scheduled spacewalk to replace a pump controller box that mission planners suspected was the source of a genuine ammonia coolant leak on the station's exterior cooling system, a real mechanical problem that needed a real fix. Roughly 2 months after that, on July 16th, Cassidy went outside again, this time with European Space Agency astronaut Luca Parmitano, on a spacewalk that had to be cut short partway through when Parmitano reported water mysteriously building up inside the back of his own helmet, floating freely around his head in a genuinely dangerous situation that forced both astronauts back inside earlier than planned. It was in the middle of this same eventful stretch, on August 19, 2013, that Cassidy noticed something drifting near the space station that did not immediately match anything on his mental list of expected debris or hardware. He spotted an object floating close to the station, near the area where the Progress 52 Russian cargo spacecraft was docked, and quickly captured video of it before radioing the sighting down to Mission Control in Houston. Whatever this object was, it was close enough and visible enough that Cassidy felt it was worth documenting and reporting through official channels immediately. Exactly the kind of instinct you would expect from someone with his combat and operational background, treating an unidentified object near his spacecraft as something to calmly investigate and report, rather than something to ignore. NASA picked up on the sighting almost immediately, and, in a move that says a lot about how the agency handles these situations, posted the footage publicly on its own YouTube channel, with a title that got straight to the point, calling it an unidentified object floating outside the station, and adding a playful qualifier suggesting the mystery would not last very long. The video and the story around it spread quickly through mainstream outlets, picked up by Space.com, NBC News, HuffPost, and Fox News within days of the original sighting, each outlet covering the footage while noting that an official explanation was already in progress. This was not a case of NASA trying to downplay or bury a strange report. The agency documented it, released the footage to the public, and treated the entire episode as a completely normal part of operating a massive, aging structure in orbit. The explanation came from Russian flight controllers rather than from NASA directly, since the specific piece of hardware involved belonged to the Russian segment of the station. Ground teams identified the object as a protective cover from one of the station's low-gain WAL antennas, a piece of equipment mounted on the Zvezda service module and specifically used to help guide the European Space Agency's uncrewed automated transfer vehicle cargo ships during their approach and docking with the station. In simple terms, this was a small, largely unremarkable piece of equipment cover that had apparently worked its way loose from where it was supposed to be securely attached, drifting free and catching Cassidy's attention purely because it happened to pass close enough to the station's cameras and windows to be noticed. NASA spokesman Josh Byerly confirmed to reporters at the time that this stray cover, now effectively a small piece of space junk, posed no realistic threat of colliding with or damaging the station itself. Once the antenna cover had been identified, mission planners did not simply move on without following up. Just 3 days later, on August 22nd, 2 Russian cosmonauts conducted a scheduled spacewalk specifically to inspect all 6 of the station's WA antennas mounted on the Zvezda module, checking the condition and positioning of each individual antenna cover. During that inspection, the cosmonauts found that several of the remaining covers were indeed loose, exactly the kind of condition that would have allowed one of them to eventually detach and drift away the way Cassidy's sighting suggested. The cosmonauts tightened the loose covers back into place during the same spacewalk, directly addressing the root mechanical issue rather than simply writing off the incident once the identification was made. Understanding why this specific piece of hardware exists at all requires understanding a little about the Zvezda module itself. Zvezda was the first major module Russia contributed to the International Space Station. Launched into orbit in the year 2000 atop a Proton rocket from the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. It served, and continues to serve, as one of the station's most important components, providing crew living quarters, key life support systems, electrical power distribution, data processing capability, and propulsion systems used to help maintain the station's orbit over time. A module carrying this much critical hardware naturally has a large number of antennas, sensors, and external covers mounted across its surface, any one of which can, over years of exposure to the temperature swings and mechanical stress of orbit, eventually work its way loose. This was not even the first time a piece of ordinary station hardware had briefly been mistaken for something more mysterious. Back in 1998, during the Shuttle Endeavour's mission to connect the newly launched American-built Unity module with the Russian-built Zvezda module for the very first time, astronauts on that mission spotted an unidentified, blob-shaped object drifting away from the docking area during their work. NASA investigators later determined that this earlier object was simply a discarded thermal cover, similar in basic concept to the antenna cover Cassidy would spot 15 years later, material that had come loose during the construction process and drifted off into its own independent orbit. Despite that mundane explanation, UFO enthusiasts online eventually worked this 1998 sighting into an entirely separate and much older piece of internet folklore, a long-running claim about a supposed ancient satellite nicknamed the Black Knight, said by believers to have been silently orbiting Earth for thousands of years. NASA's own explanation, a simple discarded thermal cover from ordinary station construction work, did nothing to slow down that particular myth spread across UFO-focused corners of the internet. Taken together, incidents like Cassidy's 2013 sighting and the earlier 1998 thermal cover episode illustrate a pattern that shows up again and again throughout the history of human spaceflight. NASA's own Assistant Administrator for Legislative Affairs, Robert F. Allnutt, addressed this exact pattern directly in a 1970 letter, writing that after 15 years of crewed space missions, including full space stations and moon landings, astronauts had not brought back a single piece of verifiable evidence, whether verbal, photographic, or otherwise, for the existence of extraterrestrial spacecraft. More than 50 years later, and across dozens of additional missions since Allnut wrote those words, that basic conclusion has held up. Objects that look mysterious, drifting near a spacecraft window, upon closer investigation, keep turning out to be exactly the kind of thing you would expect to find near any large, complex piece of machinery that has been operating continuously in a harsh environment for years. Pieces of insulation, discarded hardware, loose antenna covers, and ordinary debris caught by sunlight at an angle unfamiliar enough to make it look, for a moment, like something else. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every strange incident aboard a space station traces back to a piece of drifting hardware that can be filmed, tracked down, and physically tightened back into place during a follow-up spacewalk. Some of the most uncomfortable moments in spaceflight history never involved anything floating outside a window at all, and instead came down to a decision made quietly inside the spacecraft itself, one that an entire crew chose not to share with the people responsible for keeping them alive. Section 9. The secret William Pogue tried to hide from Houston. On November 16, 1973, astronauts Gerald Carr, Edward Gibson, and William Pogue launched aboard a Saturn IB rocket, beginning what was planned as an 84-day mission aboard Skylab, the United States' first space station. All three men were spaceflight rookies, something that set this crew apart from the two Skylab crews who had flown before them, both of which had included at least one experienced astronaut who had already flown in space. When Carr, Gibson, and Pogue floated through the hatch into Skylab for the first time, they found a strange welcoming committee waiting for them. The previous crew had stuffed 3 old flight suits with spare clothing and rags, topped each one with a paper bag head, and posed them around the station in deliberately ridiculous positions, one pedaling the exercise bike, one strapped into a medical device used to study blood pressure, and one seated on the station's toilet. It was a light-hearted prank meant to greet the incoming crew with a laugh. Carr, Gibson, and Pogue did not have much time to appreciate it. Within minutes of arriving, they were already behind on an overloaded schedule that had been planned for them before they ever left the ground. The mission's problems started almost immediately, and they had nothing to do with equipment or the space station itself. Shortly after settling in, both Carr and Pogue began to feel nauseous, an extremely common experience for astronauts adjusting to weightlessness for the first time. Pogue, whose personal nickname among his fellow astronauts was Iron Belly, a name earned specifically because he was known for having an unusually strong stomach, ended up vomiting after the crew's first meal aboard the station, an outcome that surprised even his own crewmates given his reputation. NASA's mission rules for Skylab were extremely specific about what astronauts were supposed to do if this exact situation happened. Space sickness, and vomiting in particular, was considered valuable medical data, directly relevant to NASA's broader research into how the human body adjusts to extended time in microgravity. Research that mattered enormously for planning any future missions that might keep astronauts in space for months or years at a time. The official procedure required an astronaut experiencing this kind of sickness to report it immediately to mission control, and to carefully collect and freeze a sample for later scientific analysis back on Earth, so doctors could study exactly what had happened to the body's internal chemistry. Rather than follow that procedure, the 3 astronauts had a private conversation about simply making the problem disappear instead. According to the onboard recording later recovered from the mission, Carr suggested a straightforward solution, telling his crewmates that they would not mention the incident at all and would just throw the evidence down the station's trash airlock, disposing of it before anyone on the ground ever needed to know it had happened. Pogue agreed, adding that as far as he was concerned, this would stay strictly between the 3 of them, closing the conversation by joking that it was just between him, Carr, and the couch they were sitting on. The couch, in this case, was listening. Skylab's onboard communication system was designed to periodically record conversations happening inside the cabin, and as part of his assigned duties on the mission, keeping the communications equipment properly configured, Pogue was personally responsible for managing that recording switch. On this particular night, the switch had been left in the recording position, capturing every word of the crew's private conversation about disposing of the evidence and staying quiet about the entire episode. None of the three astronauts realized this had happened. They went to sleep believing the incident was over and forgotten. It was not. While the crew slept, the recorded tape was automatically downloaded and transmitted to a tracking station, then relayed on to Mission Control in Houston, where it was transcribed along with the rest of the day's conversations and placed on the desks of NASA officials to review the next morning. When flight controllers arrived for their shift and began reading through the overnight transcripts, they found, in the crew's own recorded words, a complete account of the vomiting incident, followed immediately by a deliberate decision to conceal it from the ground. The response came quickly and directly. Later that same day, Alan Shepard, one of America's original Mercury astronauts, and by this point the chief of the astronaut office at NASA, personally got on the communications line and addressed Commander Carr. Shepard told Carr plainly that regarding the crew's status reports, NASA felt they had made a fairly serious error in judgment in how they had reported their own physical condition. This was, according to journalist Henry S.F. Cooper, writing about the incident afterward for The New Yorker, the very first time in the history of American spaceflight that a crew had ever been publicly reprimanded for their conduct while they were still actively in orbit and the mission was still underway. The consequences of the cover-up went beyond simple embarrassment or a damaged reputation. Had Pogue's sample actually been disposed of through the trash airlock as originally planned, it would have destroyed data connected to some of Skylab's ongoing medical research, including specific investigations into mineral balance in the human body during long-duration spaceflight, a subject NASA considered directly important to understanding what future astronauts would need in order to survive much longer missions than anything attempted up to that point. This was not a minor inconvenience or an administrative technicality. It represented the loss of a genuine, hard-to-replace data point in an area of medicine NASA was actively trying to build a foundation of knowledge around, using exactly the kind of real, in-flight physiological events that this specific incident represented. Flight director Neil Hutchinson, reflecting on the episode afterward, made clear that nobody at NASA doubted the basic honesty or integrity of the three astronauts involved. What concerned mission planners was something more specific and, in some ways, more difficult to fix, a growing pattern suggesting the crew was not being fully open and transparent with the people on the ground whose entire job was to keep them safe and support the mission's scientific goals. Hutchinson and other flight controllers made it clear internally that going forward, any additional problems that arose during the mission would require an immediate, direct response from Mission Control to make sure similar situations did not happen again. This tension did not stay contained to a single uncomfortable conversation. In the weeks that followed, relations between the Skylab 4 crew and Mission Control grew increasingly strained, driven by a genuine and serious underlying problem that had nothing to do with any single dramatic incident. NASA had scheduled this final, 84-day Skylab mission with an extremely demanding workload, one built on the assumption that Carr, Gibson, and Pogue would perform at the same high level of efficiency the previous, more experienced Skylab crew had achieved. That earlier crew, however, had included veteran astronauts who already understood how to move, work, and adapt efficiently in microgravity from first-hand experience. Carr, Gibson, and Pogue, as an entirely rookie crew, needed real time to adjust to living and working in zero gravity, time that NASA's original schedule for them did not meaningfully account for. Carr himself later explained, in an interview recorded for NASA's own oral history project, that the crew had told mission managers early on that they did not believe the planned pace of work was realistic to sustain across a full 84-day mission, and that everyone involved had initially agreed the schedule needed to slow down. In practice, additional experiments and tasks kept getting added on top of an already full plan, and the crew found themselves consistently falling further behind, a problem that only deepened the friction that had begun with the concealed sickness incident weeks earlier. Despite this rocky start, the Skylab 4 mission went on to accomplish an enormous amount of genuine scientific work. Roughly a week into the flight, a serious mechanical problem developed in one of Skylab's 3 critical gyroscopes, the spinning devices responsible for keeping the station properly oriented in space, caused by insufficient lubrication inside the mechanism. Since Skylab was specifically designed so that any 2 of its 3 gyroscopes could keep the station stable on their own, the failure did not immediately threaten the mission, though a second gyroscope later developed similar symptoms and had to be carefully managed using special temperature control procedures to keep it functioning for the rest of the flight. On Thanksgiving Day that same November, Gibson and Pogue completed a 6.5-hour spacewalk, spending part of it deploying scientific experiments and replacing film in the station's solar observatory, and the remainder repairing a malfunctioning antenna. Gibson personally recorded roughly 75,000 new telescopic images of the Sun over the course of the mission, and in January 1974, he captured what became the first ever filmed recording, from space, of an active region on the Sun's surface, actually erupting into a solar flare in real time. By the time the mission ended, Carr, Gibson, and Pogue had orbited the Earth 1,214 times, traveled more than 34 million miles, and set a spaceflight endurance record of 84 days that stood as the longest American spaceflight for nearly 2 decades afterward. It is worth being precise about what part of this mission's story is actually documented fact and what part is closer to legend. Skylab 4 is often remembered publicly for 2 specific things: a supposed strike or mutiny in which the crew allegedly rebelled against mission control, and the concealed sick bag incident. Historians and the astronauts themselves have consistently pushed back against the mutiny framing, and a genuine, roughly 90-minute period of lost radio contact toward the end of December 1973 has never been definitively proven to be a deliberate act of protest rather than a scheduling mix-up, with Carr and Gibson both suggesting afterward that the crew had simply forgotten to properly restore radio contact after a shift change in their communication duties. The vomit concealment incident carries no such ambiguity. It exists in the crew's own recorded voices, preserved in an official NASA transcript, followed by a direct, on-the-record reprimand from Alan Shepard himself, making it one of the most solidly documented moments of genuine, deliberate concealment in the entire history of American human spaceflight. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Not every strained relationship between astronauts and the people responsible for their safety gets resolved as cleanly as this one eventually did. Some conflicts between a crew and the ground never make it into an official transcript at all, and the full truth of exactly what happened only comes out decades later, once the people who lived through it are finally willing to talk about it honestly. Section 10. The mutiny NASA never officially called a mutiny. By 1968, NASA badly needed a win. Nearly 2 years earlier, on January 27, 1967, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee had died in a fire that swept through their Apollo command module during a routine launchpad test. A disaster that grounded the entire crewed spaceflight program for 20 months, while investigators determined what had gone wrong and engineers redesigned the spacecraft from the ground up. The 3 astronauts assigned to fly the program's first crewed mission after that disaster carried an enormous weight on their shoulders, tasked with proving, in front of a watching world, that the redesigned Apollo spacecraft was finally safe enough to fly. That crew was Commander Walter Schirra, Command Module Pilot Don Eisele, and Lunar Module Pilot Walter Cunningham, a name they kept even though their specific mission, Apollo 7, never actually carried a lunar module at all. Schirra was by far the most experienced of the three, having already flown in both the Mercury and Gemini programs, making him the only person to eventually fly in all three of America's original human spaceflight programs. Eisele and Cunningham had never been to space before, though both had built serious careers as military pilots and engineers before joining NASA's astronaut corps. All three men had originally trained as the backup crew for the ill-fated Apollo 1 mission, meaning they had a direct, personal connection to the disaster before they ever launched, a connection Schirra, in particular, carried heavily, since Gus Grissom had been both his friend and his neighbor. Tension between the crew and mission control started before Apollo 7 even left the ground. Flight controllers and the crew had reportedly agreed in advance that the mission would not launch if wind conditions at Cape Canaveral were blowing in from the ocean toward the coast. On the morning of October 11, 1968, the launch manager decided to proceed with the countdown anyway, despite conditions that arguably violated that earlier agreement. Schirra was not happy about the decision, and this friction set an uneasy tone for what should have been a triumphant morning. Roughly 15 hours into the flight, Schirra woke up with a severe head cold, and within a day or two, both of his crewmates had caught it as well. An ordinary head cold might sound like a minor inconvenience, but in weightlessness, the usual mechanics of a cold become significantly worse. On Earth, gravity helps mucus drain naturally out of the sinuses. In orbit, with no gravity pulling anything downward, that same mucus simply stays trapped inside the head, building up pressure and congestion, with no natural way to clear itself. Cunningham later described the effect vividly, recalling that it quickly turned their spacecraft into what amounted to a floating tissue box. All three men spent much of the mission relying on aspirin and over-the-counter decongestants just to function through their scheduled workload. The sickness fed directly into a string of increasingly testy exchanges with mission control. On the very first day, when ground controllers asked the crew to power up their onboard television camera for a planned broadcast ahead of schedule, Schirra flatly refused, telling Houston that the crew had not yet had a chance to properly set up their equipment or eat a meal, adding, according to the official mission transcript, that he already had a cold and was not willing to disrupt their schedule any further to accommodate the request. This was an unusually blunt response for an active NASA commander to give the people responsible for coordinating his mission from the ground, and it set the tone for several more standoffs that followed over the coming days. Sleep, or the near-total lack of it, made everything worse. Because NASA's network of ground tracking stations could only maintain radio contact with the spacecraft for a few minutes out of every 90-minute orbit, Mission Control wanted at least one crew member awake and monitoring the spacecraft's systems at all times. Eisele later wrote candidly about how poorly this actually worked in practice, admitting that he had serious trouble sleeping for the entire mission because of his unusual sleep schedule combined with the noise and activity from his two crewmates, explaining that after the very first night, he was surviving on short catnaps for 2 days at a time, before finally collapsing for 6 to 8 hours of real rest every third night. His two crewmates were not sleeping any better. By the 9th day of the mission, exhaustion, illness, and mounting frustration boiled over into one of the most quoted exchanges of the entire flight. During a test that required the crew to repeatedly fire the spacecraft's small maneuvering thrusters to keep it properly stabilized, Schirra lost his patience with Mission Control, telling Houston that he wanted to know the name of whoever had come up with the test so he could speak to that person directly once he was back on the ground. Eisele immediately piled on, sarcastically asking Mission Control to also identify whoever had designed a specific navigation exercise called the P-22 Horizon Test, calling it another real beauty. The single biggest confrontation of the mission, however, centered on something with genuine safety implications, not just scheduling frustration. Every previous American crewed spaceflight across the entire Mercury and Gemini programs had required astronauts to wear their helmets during re-entry and landing, a standard safety procedure in case the cabin lost pressure unexpectedly during the intense stress of returning through Earth's atmosphere. With their sinuses still clogged from days of illness, Schirra and his crew had been managing the pressure in their heads throughout the mission by pinching their noses and blowing to force air through their blocked sinus passages, a common trick anyone who has flown on a commercial airplane with a stuffy nose might recognize. The newly designed Apollo helmets, unlike the older Mercury and Gemini models, had no visor opening that would allow an astronaut to reach up and pinch their own nose while wearing one. Schirra became convinced that if the crew wore their helmets sealed shut during the violent pressure changes of re-entry, with no way to equalize the pressure building inside their heads, they risked rupturing their own eardrums. Schirra raised this concern directly with Deke Slayton, NASA's Director of Flight Crew Operations, in an exchange preserved in the mission's official transcript. Slayton pushed back, pointing out that NASA had absolutely no prior spaceflight experience landing a crew without their helmets sealed on. Schirra shot back that there was equally no prior experience landing with a stuffy, congested crew wearing helmets they could not adjust either. Slayton eventually told Schirra that he understood the concern, and that Mission Control's only real worry was making sure the crew landed safely, adding that if the crew chose to fly without their helmets, it would ultimately be their own necks on the line, though he hoped Schirra would not end up breaking his. Schirra thanked him and made his decision. He informed the flight controllers that he was in command of the mission and that the crew would not be wearing their helmets during re-entry, regardless of any objection from the ground. Reflecting on the decision decades later, during a 1999 NASA oral history interview, Cunningham explained the medical reasoning plainly, comparing it to landing an airplane with a bad cold, except far more extreme given the speed and force involved in a spacecraft's re-entry, warning that the pressure buildup involved could genuinely rupture an astronaut's eardrums if they had no way to relieve it. NASA's own Director of Flight Operations, Christopher Kraft, was reportedly furious in the moment, demanding an explanation for what he saw as open insubordination from his mission's own commander. In the end, Schirra held his ground, and the decision stood. Apollo 7 splashed down safely in the Atlantic Ocean on October 22, 1968, roughly 200 nautical miles southwest of Bermuda, after a mission lasting just under 11 days. Nobody suffered a burst eardrum. Nobody was injured during landing at all. By every meaningful technical measurement, the mission was an unqualified success. Every major test objective was completed. Several unplanned bonus objectives were achieved along the way, and Apollo 7 proved, conclusively, that the redesigned spacecraft was finally safe enough to carry astronauts toward the Moon, clearing the path for Apollo 8's historic lunar orbit mission just 2 months later. Success on paper did not erase what had happened between the crew and the ground. In a break from the standard practice NASA followed for every other Apollo crew, Schirra, Eisele, and Cunningham did not receive NASA's Distinguished Service Medal, the agency's highest honor, immediately after their flight, an omission that stood out clearly against how every other successful Apollo crew had been treated. It would take 40 years, until 2008 under NASA Administrator Michael Griffin, for the agency to formally correct that omission and award the 3 men their medals retroactively, by which point both Eisele and Schirra had already passed away, leaving Cunningham as the only crew member alive to accept the overdue recognition in person. None of the 3 astronauts ever flew in space again. For Schirra, this was by his own design rather than a punishment, since he had already publicly announced his intention to retire from both NASA and the Navy before Apollo 7 ever launched, meaning Apollo 7 was always going to be his final spaceflight, regardless of how the mission went. For Isella and Cunningham, the situation was very different. Astronaut Jim Lovell, reflecting on the mission afterward, summarized the general sentiment among their fellow astronauts plainly, describing Apollo 7 as an excellent, technically successful flight that had nonetheless been genuinely contentious, adding that the crew had frustrated the people on the ground considerably enough that it effectively closed the door on any future flights for them. According to some accounts from people close to the program at the time, Christopher Kraft privately told Deke Slayton that he was unwilling to work with any member of that crew on a future mission ever again. Each man's career afterward reflected this fallout in a different way. Shearer transitioned smoothly into a very public post-NASA life, joining legendary broadcaster Walter Cronkite as a television commentator for the remaining Apollo missions, and later becoming a paid television spokesman for a nasal decongestant brand, a job that let him make light of the very cold that had defined his final spaceflight. Isella's path was rockier. In addition to his role in the Apollo 7 tension, he became the first active NASA astronaut to go through a divorce, quickly followed by a remarriage, at a time when the space agency was still deeply invested in presenting its astronauts publicly as clean-cut, all-American family men. He went on to serve only as a backup command module pilot for Apollo 10, a role widely seen within NASA as a lukewarm, unenthusiastic performance, and he never received another flight assignment before leaving the agency. Writing candidly about the Apollo 7 mission years later, Acel did not shy away from acknowledging what the crew had done, describing their behavior during the flight as insolent, high-handed, and calculating at times, before adding that whether people wanted to call it paranoia or simply being smart, it had gotten the job done, and that the crew had genuinely delivered a great flight despite all of it. Cunningham's path took a slightly different turn. Rather than being sidelined entirely, he was assigned as the lead astronaut, helping shape NASA's upcoming Skylab program, a role he later called his most significant overall contribution to the space agency. Even though intense competition for Skylab's limited flight slots, combined with Slayton's own view that Cunningham's background as a physicist made him more suited to a scientific support role than an actual mission command, meant he was never assigned to fly aboard Skylab himself. Despite everything that happened, Cunningham remained proud of what the Apollo 7 crew had accomplished for the rest of his life, noting decades later that Apollo 7 still stood, in his view, as the longest, most ambitious, and most successful first test flight of any new crewed vehicle in history. What makes the story of Apollo 7 worth remembering, alongside every other case in this video, is exactly how different its central conflict was from anything involving strange lights, unexplained sounds, or objects drifting outside a window. There was no debris to identify, no cosmic ray to trace, no antenna cover to tighten back into place. The entire conflict played out in plain, recorded language between three sick, exhausted men in orbit and a room full of equally stressed flight controllers back on Earth, all of it preserved word for word in NASA's own official transcripts for anyone willing to go looking. It stands as one of the clearest reminders in the entire history of spaceflight that the most unpredictable, hardest to manage variable in any mission was never really the spacecraft, the radiation, or the vacuum of space itself. It was always the human beings inside the capsule, and the strain that isolation, exhaustion, and illness could place on even the most experienced, most disciplined astronauts NASA had ever trained. Every account in this video, from a whistling sound behind the moon to a valve that opened too early, from a rubber seal that looked alive to a head cold that nearly cost 3 men their careers, shares the same underlying thread. Real spaceflight, stripped of exaggeration and stripped of invented detail, is stranger, more human, and more genuinely unsettling than almost anything that needs to be made up about it. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.